To start here, I think we have whatever a quorum would be. And welcome everybody to the January presentation by the Emeriti Association. We have a wonderfully advertised guest speaker for our members today. And I'd like to introduce Stephen Adler to introduce who's the Vice President of the Emeriti Association for this year, to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Professor Jacoby. Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year, for what it's worth. I hope everybody will enjoy a better year this year than we did seem to have done last year. So moving ahead, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and Warren College faculty colleague, Professor Cathy Gere from the Department of History, who will be speaking today on property, psychology, and the environment in a warming world. Just a little brief bio of Professor Gere. Cathy Gere was born in London in 1964, attended and was expelled from a grammar school in Hammersmith, and did 2 years at Oxford University, 1 year of English and 1 of politics and philosophy, before dropping out to pursue political activism, including 2 years living in a squat in downtown Manhattan. In 1984, she did a carpentry course at Deptford Skills Center and earned her living that way for the next decade in London, New York, and San Francisco. In her 30s, she completed her education, culminating in a PhD in history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. After a postdoc at King's College, Cambridge, she worked at the University of Chicago in an adjunct capacity for a couple of years before moving to UC San Diego, where she is professor of history of science. She is the author of 3 books, the latest of which is Pain, Pleasure, and the Greater Good, from the Panopticon to the Skinner Box and Beyond. Winner of the 2020 History of Science Society Prize for the best book written for a wider public, and a Choice Award for outstanding academic title. She is currently working on a project about climate change and the politics of common ownership. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Professor Cathy Gere. Cathy, you're on.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for this opportunity and for the details, some of the details of my misspent youth that you have given. I figured that at this point in my career, it's all right to, be frank about my checkered past. So anyway, and actually some of it's relevant to the talk that I'm going to give today. So let me attempt to share my screen here. Hang on 1 second, I'm not seeing the, oops.
Someone needs to give her co-host ability to share her screen.
I do actually have co-host ability. It's just when I'm not seeing my PowerPoint on my options. Here we go. Sorry. All right, here we go. Okay, is that visible, my title screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Joel. I see you nodding your head. Hi, Joel. Good to see you. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk today. This is a talk based on my current work in progress. I seem to have a habit of alighting like a butterfly from one intellectual blossom to another. So I am now going from history of psychology and neuroscience to a project on, as Stephen said, on climate change and the challenge of climate change and the questions of property regimes and which ones might answer the challenge that we face. And so I'm going to start back in 2018, which started out, it was a very bad year for anyone with any environmental sensibilities. It started out January 1st with China starting to refuse to accept any waste for recycling from the United States. And so the whole question of plastic pollution became incredibly urgent in 2018 and was one of the kind of top environmental issues that was hitting the headlines a lot. And more locally speaking, it ended with the Paradise fires here in California. And I'm sure that many of you will remember these really disturbing events when the town of Paradise went up in flames in a very serious wildfire event, including people being burned in their cars as they tried to escape through the flames, and it killed 85 people. I think the worst loss of life in California wildfire history. And so in 2018, I was at a particular moment in my career, I'd made full professor after my winding road through academia, and finished my third book and published it. And so having been really a lifelong environmentalist, I felt very much called back to environmental activism. And so the question that I was confronted with was, you know, how, having had an activist past and then having sort of gone back into a more kind of mainstream life and had this wonderful second act for which I'm so grateful. I was really confronted with the question of how to take action. And so at that point, my environmental sensibility was really focused on personal actions. So I use the word ecorexia. It's a neologism. It's a back formation from anorexia, and it denotes, Joel, I hope it'll find its way into DSM-6. It denotes a sort of obsessive and self-sabotaging, somewhat self-sabotaging imperative to limit one's own environmental impact. And so that was, my ecorexia was getting a bit out of control. And yet I found myself very much stymied in terms of taking more collective action rather than this kind of individual focus. And so in 2018, this combination of things, and really I think the intensification of the climate emergency and the environmental crisis really brought me to these questions: whether to act, how to act, where to act, at what scale, and within what framework. And part of the issue for me was that there wasn't a political framework that I found palatable, really. I scraped this off the floor of the internet today. And so here we have a little schematic of the political spectrum. And what I liked about this one was that environmental politics are counted here at a particular place on the spectrum. And this is really where I found them in this period of my life. So between the far and the center left. So here we see eco-socialism listed as one of the elements on the political spectrum. And I, for many reasons, but much having to do with having had a lot of experience, you know, decades and more of experience of activism on the far left, I found eco-socialism an extremely problematic framework. Much of the academic stuff and sort of activist work writing about the environment was in this framework that I was reading, was in this framework. And so for various reasons, but especially having to do with my experiences on the left, I found this a very difficult to try and fit in or to take action. And really the problem for me was the psychological premise, what I understood to the psychological premise of eco-socialism and of the left in general. Which I took to be something along these lines. This, of course, is a simplification. And a lot of time in this writing, it was rather deeply buried. But I would summarize it thus, that capitalism somehow conspires to bring out the worst in us. And here is a quotation, there's many such. Talking about neoliberal identity creation by treating people as selfish, rational utility maximizers, the architects of neoliberalism actively encourage us to become selfish, rational utility maximizers. And against that conspiracy of human manipulation, I think the left argues that we are malleable and perfectible, and that somehow eco-socialism will wreak a change in human nature and turn us into far more cooperative beings. And it was this premise that I found, I mean, you know, in my capacity as sort of burned out old communard, I found sort of implausible and luxurious. Like we have the luxury of these 19th century utopianism. And given the fact that environmental things are more urgent than that, I figured we can't sort of wait around for this beautiful transformation to take place. And so I started trying to write my way out of this dilemma, talk about luxury. So in a fellowship at the Max Planck Institute of History of Science in Berlin, I started writing this rather kind of freewheeling, very personal manuscript tackling these questions. And I actually completed a whole manuscript with this name. I can't remember if this was the subtitle, but anyway, Garbo Love's Bourgeois Psychology and the Limits of Nature. And this was an exploration of the psychology of capitalism. And I mean, it was very freewheeling, it covered all kinds of things, but there was one whole chapter that was based on the film inspired by and a tribute to the film Ninotchka, which was Greta Garbo's penultimate screen appearance, and one of her first or very rare turns to comedy, in which she reveals herself to be a really quite brilliant comedian. And it was just a coincidence. My wife brought home this film, and I remembered that it was my father's favorite film. And so in watching it, about halfway through, I realized that it really was the key to this question about bourgeois psychology. It's a comedy about a Soviet apparatchik who is sent to Paris in 1937 on a quest to sort out the sale of some jewelry confiscated from a Grand Duchess in the Russian Revolution. And of course, she's played by Garbo, and she's extremely puritanical and very devout Bolshevik. And then she gets seduced by the loveliness of Paris and by the loveliness of Count Algou, pictured here. This is the central scene in the film, is this pratfall when she suddenly bursts out laughing. He's trying to seduce her and he falls off his chair, and she bursts out laughing, and her kind of slightly cruel amusement at his loss of dignity is what melts her heart and sends her into the sort of second half of the movie. And so anyway, I was working away at this manuscript and just really trying to understand how to work, how to live, how to act without the assumption, without the utopian assumption of eco-socialist psychology. And so this kind of investigation of what, what is bourgeois psychology and why is it so powerful? And in the course of writing this manuscript, I started to, I was writing a lot about my activist past, including the years in living in a squat in downtown Manhattan. And we visited the Lower East Side that summer on my way back from Berlin. And I was trying to capture something of the really, the absurdity, the human comedy of that scene, of that far left sort of anarchist scene. And I came up with the pun, the comedy of the commons, scribbling in a Polish diner in the Lower East Side. And so upon being reunited with my computer that evening, I Googled the phrase, the comedy of the commons, to see if it was much used or kind of how people understood it. And the first thing that came up was an article by that name by the woman pictured here in the red jacket, who is a legal theorist by the name of Carol Rose. She's a legal philosopher, really. And so I read the article, intrigued, and it was really a life-changing discovery, this, because it introduced me to, first of all, it answered so many of my questions about different kinds of the relationship between psychology and politics, answered a lot of those questions. And it introduced me to this vast literature and this huge whole school of thought about common property regimes. So the article is about common property, and Carol Rose's work looks at the role of common property regimes in common law. And so I was just astonished to find that there was this whole body of work, this whole body of research that I felt, first of all, answered a lot of my questions, and also seemed to present or offer a framework within which environmental action could be undertaken in this kind of practical and non-utopian register. And so first, some background. Some of this may be incredibly familiar to you. The commons is one of those things, before you find it, well, you just don't know it's there. And then you find it, it seems like it's absolutely everywhere and everyone knows about it. So anyway, if you are in that latter category, my apologies for this survey of some of the most well-known, the kind of high points of this literature, but important background to kind of set up this, this argument. So no account of the commons is complete without discussion of this person, Garrett Hardin, pictured here, who was a UC Santa Barbara ecologist and zoologist working in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, who coined or who reintroduced the notion of the commons into political philosophy in 1968 in a very short paper in Science magazine that called The Tragedy of the Commons. That is still the most cited paper in the journal's history. And Hardin was a Malthusian environmentalist and an advocate for global population control. And the article, very short article, it's really just a plea for for population control, for limiting the unfettered freedom of the human species to replicate itself. Hardin's background was he grew up in Texas in the 1920s and 30s, witnessed firsthand some of the depredations of the ecological crisis, of the Dust Bowl, worked in the University of Chicago and got a degree in zoology from Stanford University, and was an extremely committed Malthusian eugenicist and public intellectual, really. He didn't have a research career, but he devoted himself to writing textbooks and advocating for population control. And so his article, The Tragedy of the Commons, was a plea for population control, in the course of which he made an analogy. And the analogy was between the planet as a whole and an overgrazed, commonly owned pasture. And so he argued that the problem of common ownership, this is the tragedy of the commons, the problem of common ownership is that if no one has a single property interest in preserving a natural resource, such as a meadow, if it's just kind of open to everybody to use and to plunder, everybody will rush in with his cow and graze the pasture and use these resources, with the result that they will end up in a state of ecological degradation. And at the end of his thought experiment about the meadow, he says this thing: ruin is the destination towards which all men rush. And so this was just a thought experiment, but it actually became the most notorious, partly because it was the title of the article. It became much the most focused upon part of his argument. And it ended up swamping everything else. Only in China was the population angle taken up, resulting a decade later in the notorious one-child policy. Everywhere else, the tragedy of the commons became this world-altering mean for rethinking the relationship between property, psychology, and environmental outcomes. And the people most keen on the thought experiment were indeed these architects of neoliberalism, who used the idea of the tragedy of the commons to argue for the privatization of all kinds of different natural resources, for the selling off of nationalized industries, for the privatization of water, for cap and trade schemes, all of these sorts of laissez-faire or capitalist solutions to the environmental crisis, or to problems of environmental degradation. So Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons became this kind of shorthand for this sort of approach. I think the results of that approach speak for themselves. Neoliberalism has not been a friend to the environment. I'm not going to say that it's been horrible for humans. I think the the jury may be out in that respect, globally speaking, but for the environment, pretty much a catastrophe. And so the tragedy of the commons, pretty inauspicious as a framework for understanding or solving environmental problems. But Hardin did not go unchallenged. The idea of the tragedy of the commons did not go unchallenged. And most prominent of his critics is this woman pictured here receiving the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 2009, Elinor Ostrom. And Elinor Ostrom, with her husband Vincent, set up an institute at the University of Indiana, the Bloomington Institute. Well, the Bloomington School is how they're known. And they set up this workshop for studying real common property regimes in the real world, of which there are thousands. And so by studying scores, hundreds of real world examples, the Ostroms and their team were able to argue absolutely persuasively that common property regimes do not necessarily lead to environmental degradation, but by contrast, they are often successful in preserving environmental natural resources over generations. And so they studied all kinds of things from irrigation systems to grazing meadows to forests, to all of these different resources that were owned and managed by a community of users, fisheries, so many different examples, and showed that there were things that all the successful ones, or most of the successful ones, had in common. There were certain kind of rules for managing commons that produce these successful outcomes. And so this work was attracted more and more people, anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists. The Ostroms were political scientists, all kinds of people studying these regimes. And after she won the Nobel in 2009, it really became a movement of people studying, analysing and promoting common property regimes as actual solutions to environmental resource conservation problems. Finally, to this of the tragedy of the commons, and then the kind of corresponding idea of the traditional commons that is successful in conserving natural resources. I would like to add the urban commons, and this is Carol Rose's specialty, and she was inspired by the court cases in the late 60s and early 70s that turned our beaches, California's beaches, over to the people that made them into common property, into investigating the the precedents for common property in the history of common law. And what she discovered was that the best established precedent for common ownership of a resource like a beach in the law is the common ownership of streets, roads, highways, and waterways. And so rather uncelebrated and unnoticed as examples of commons, the streets are owned by all who use them. And this is the lovely streetscape a block away from where I'm sitting right now, Park Boulevard in University Heights. And so all of these are different examples of the manifestations of different examples of these kinds of common property regimes. And of course, California's beaches are extremely well known and well understood as examples of the commons since the state Supreme Court decision of 1970 that made them over to the people of California, to the people of the state. And this is just a picture of a couple of stranded assets, I would say, not exactly stranded assets, but interesting examples of structures that were built before that decision. And so on the left, we have the Marine Room restaurant, and the Marine Room was built as part of La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club in 1941, right at the high tide line. And the Supreme Court decision was that all the beach below the mean high tide line is public property, is common property, which is why if you ever swim in front of the Marine Room, as I do, we really are legally allowed to stash our goggles and sandals and whatever on the Marine Room's deep cement windowsills, because they belong to us. And it is really beautiful swimming there. And on the right is Bell's Pavilion, that funny mushroom-shaped thing on Black's Beach, a beautiful example of something that was built right before the Supreme Court decision. I think it's 1968. And there's a little sign on it over here that says, do enjoy the beach. This is private property. And I'm sure they were none too pleased. The billionaire owner was none too pleased when the beach ceased to be private property. So anyway, these are just some examples of common property and famous examples of common property and common property regimes. And so after reading Carol Rose and Eleanor Ostrom and finding all these wonderful scholars working on the commons, I started to see commons everywhere. And so having felt a bit kind of trapped in this hyper-capitalist world, I started to appreciate the extent to which my life is really sustained by common property regimes, from the bike lanes along the streets, from my bike to the free shuttle that I ride to my job at this great public university. These are a couple of my personal favorite commons. One is the Dharma Bomb Temple, which is a communally owned, collectively owned old church in my neighborhood that is being repurposed as a Buddhist temple. It's completely collectively owned and run, and it's just the most wonderful place. I'm terribly sad that it's closed. My mental health is suffering because I can't go there and meditate. On the left is a superbly beautiful hidden gem of London. So if anyone's going to London, this is my top tourist tip, this is Fulham Palace, which was the old palace of the bishops of London until the 1970s. And here you can see it's a 37-acre site on the River Thames, and it used to be completely enclosed for the princes of the church. And then in the First World War, all of this area here was turned over to the people for victory gardens. So turned into allotments, and they remain allotments to this day. And so this massive community garden scheme. And then in the 1970s, the rest of the estate was turned over to the people. So it's a beautiful example of recommoning, where an area that was enclosed and private is then turned back over to the people, like the beaches of California. And it's just, it's free and it's exquisitely beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places in London. Beautiful, peaceful, kind of green retreat in the heart of a very busy part of London. So anyway, I start seeing commons everywhere. I become interested. So one of the most important things I think about this commons, the work on the commons, and especially the Ostrom's work, is that they operate within a set of psychological assumptions in trying to understand what makes common property regimes work or not. And the set of psychological assumptions are that people are essentially self-interested. And so this was one of the things that I found most refreshing about this work on the commons, was that it wasn't predicated on the perfectibility of humans, but rather on this idea of fundamentally self-interested, but also incorrigibly social human nature, which just really spoke to me as as a good and realistic understanding of human nature. And since the work that that they've been doing, that the Ostroms did, there's been a lot of work in psychology to try and understand the psychology of collective action problems, like common resource conservation problems. And this is just the set of necessary kind of psychological conditions that need to be met for successfully overcoming the kinds of things that incentivize people to engage in collective action. So understanding, belonging, trusting, and self-enhancing. So these are the kinds of conditions that are shown to be conducive to this kind of collective action problem solving. And so I just think it's psychologically extremely acute work, and that the assumption of self-interestedness is precisely what allows the collective action problem both to be described and also to start to be solved. And then finally, in terms of different kinds of commons, of course, in this nation, the most historically profound and example of the commons, of course, is the indigenous commons. There is a deep ideological history behind the dispossession of the indigenous commons in this country's history. And I was very interested to discover that the whole discourse about common ownership and private ownership is really deep in the history of the relationship between the US government and the Native American nations who once occupied this continent. And here I have a quotation from Thomas Hartley Crawford, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And so I hope that you can see that some of this stuff about common ownership is really ideologically explicit in the whole discussion of, the Indian problem. And so here he is saying, unless some system is marked out by which there shall be a separate allotment of land to each individual, you will look in vain for any casting off of savagism. Common property and civilization cannot coexist. And so this idea that that civilization is predicated on this this investment in this private and individual investment in resources is very, very deep in this whole discussion in the 19th century. A few decades later, Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, returning from a trip to Indian country, said, because they hold their land in common, there is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbors. There is no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. And Henry Dawes made good on his contempt for common property by being the architect of the so-called Dawes Act, which was the act that broke up Indian territory into 160-acre parcels, which were then allotted to individual families for farming. And the idea was to thus convert Native Americans who had little or no or not any conventional sort of bourgeois idea of individual property, to convert them to Christianity, farming, and private property. And of course, one of the great benefits for the settler state of this act was that all the leftover land would then be available for settlement. And here you can see an advertisement at the height of the Dawes Act sales, Indian land for sale, early 20th century advertisement. It was such a disaster, the Dawes Act, that it was repealed in 1934. But you can see, I hope, that the discussion of the commons is very deeply written into the sort of DNA of American property law and history. So anyway, having sort of absorbed some of this history and philosophy of the commons, and the psychology, indeed, of the commons, and of this approach to environmental issues, and having found this kind of profound gestalt switch that this produced, sort of seeing that there are partially decommodified common property regimes, that my whole life is sustained by these, you know, community-supported agriculture, farmers markets, you know, all of these kinds of, these sorts of provisioning kinds of things. I started seeing them everywhere. And it really changed my view also of the public university, to see the public university as a commons. So it's, you know, it is the property of all of us who live and work and study there, right? And it is answerable to the people of the state. And so in seeing the university as a commons, it was deeply kind of intuitive and appealing to me when I discovered a group of activists working at the institutional scale, to a group of climate activists working at the institutional scale within the university. And so I joined the organization, the Green New Deal at UCSD, and in the spirit of the commons. And we are a group of a grassroots organization, democratically organized grassroots organization. It's very commonsy, grassroots organization of students, staff, faculty, retirees, who advocate for the university to address the the 300,000 metric tons of CO2 that UCSD emits every year, the 1.5 million plus tons of CO2 that the whole UC emits every year. And we are campaigning for the divestment of the university endowment and commercial banking and insurance from the fossil fuel industry. And also we have a campaign about teaching about environmental problems and specifically about the climate crisis. And so it was in the spirit of thinking about the commons and about what it means to work within your own commons that I joined this organization. And so the framework of the commons kind of answered my question about how to act and where to act and within what framework. And so one of our current campaigns is that we recently circulated a petition, and the petition request was that the university draw up plans. So this is a petition that we initiated in the name of the 10 campus kind of offshoot of the Green New Deal at UCSD. There's a 10 campus offshoot, the UC Green New Deal Alliance. And in the name of the 10 campus organization, we circulated a petition asking that the university draw up plans, not invest in infrastructure yet, but just in plans for the electrification of the campus energy systems that currently run on fracked natural gas. And so natural gas is a fossil fuel. It emits methane and carbon dioxide. 75% of the university's energy is derived from natural gas. And so all the experts agree that the only route to decarbonisation has to go through electrification. And so our demand is for the electrification of the university energy systems. And we're just asking that the university be shovel ready for possible green stimulus funds. We circulated the petition before the election, but we were hopeful. It's actually, the results in the Senate have exceeded our expectations. So I think there's a good chance that the Biden-Sanders Unity Plan, Green New Deal plan, will be available. And the quotation here is from Obama, who said, the problem about the stimulus, the green stimulus funds that he authorized in 2009 was that there weren't enough shovel-ready projects. And so the idea of being shovel-ready, I think, makes a lot of sense within this political moment. And so not only is the university a commons, but of course a municipality is also a commons. And I'm a member of the San Diego Green New Deal Alliance, which is works at the municipal level on exactly these kinds of issues, and especially on transportation, which is of course a huge issue for climate, and especially here in Southern California, the epicenter of car culture. And so, yeah, just quickly, shovel ready for me also brings up this idea of prefigurative politics. So this idea that you kind of organize where you are in a prefigurative mode. So you're trying to kind of organize so that you're ready, shovel ready for when a kind of top down, you organize from the bottom up so that when the top down imperative to kind of address these issues is finally at hand, you've already done some work to prepare the ground at the local level. So rather than needing to organize at the national or even global level, which a lot of people feel about climate change, I think there's a good case for organizing at the local level in this commons framework. And I think of this as prefigurative politics. So in answer to the question about what's a burned out old ecorexic to do, well, whether to act, well, yes, of course, it's a crisis. How to act? Well, not assuming that, you know, we're some beautiful kumbaya sort of transformation will take place in human psychology, but not expecting fellow activists to embody great virtue, but just attending to self-care, knowing that it's really arduous work, knowing that there's going to be meetings and there's probably going to be extremely annoying interpersonal dynamics, and just, you know, hanging in there. Where to act? Well, locally, at what scale, the municipal and institutional scale, and within the framework of the commons. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much.
Cathy, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, and it met certainly all of my expectations and more. So Suzanne, I'd like to ask you now if you would take over the emceeing responsibilities to field any questions.
Okay, so we'll field questions. Thank you very much, Professor Gere, for that wonderful presentation. You are welcome, participants, to raise your hand electronically, or, you know, there are not that many. I think you could just speak up if you'd like. Bob Knox?
Yeah, thank you very much for that talk. You obviously came to your punchline slide with advocacy of less than top-down activities, more bottom-up. But at some point they meet the top-down things of global warming, for example, which is clearly global. And so there are plenty of people, as you know, working hard internationally up there. I assume that for any given individual, your advice might be to, you know, go where you think you can have the most effect at either end of that scale. But I'm just curious to hear where you think the balance and trade-offs are in that that spectrum of global activities versus the kind of local activities that you, I think, made a very effective case for.
Thank you so much for the question. It's such a good question. And yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that part of what makes UCSD or the university you know, a sort of accessible site for me is the fact that I'm a member of this community. And so you know, and as such, I have a voice. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. That's exactly what I would say is, you know, figure out where it is that you think you can have an effect. Eleanor Ostrom, the author of Governing the Commons, she talks about polycentric governance. And so she's very, very interested in these kinds of grassroots, bottom-up forms of organization. But what the Bloomington School, their philosophy is this idea that each institution is nested in a structure of polycentric governance that can go all the way up to the transnational level. And so, so for example, the United Nations might be, or the Conference of Parties, you know, these COP meetings or something like that, that might be the kind of global level that represents the sort of the outside ring of a polycentric governance structure. And so, yeah, the idea though, I think this shovel-ready kind of shorthand for this, for the idea of the plans, for the demand for electrification plans, is that the top-down stuff won't work unless the ground is prepared from the bottom up as well. And so we did get quite a few responses to the petition, people saying, well, why would you bother to work on a global issue at a local level? You know, and it's such a good question. It's such an obvious question because global warming has global in it. But I think that's the answer, is that it's no point releasing federal green stimulus money unless there are shovel-ready projects, you know, able to take it up. And so otherwise, just at this very practical level, that money will go unspent. And so, yeah, I would absolutely say wherever you think, you know, I mean, I so respect David Victor's work in the Paris agreements, you know, and all of the decarbonization initiative work. It's a little lofty for me, you know, and so I really like the more kind of local level, but beautiful question.
All right, and just a quick related one, what would you have to say? And I'm not sure whether it's I think it's more a global thing than not, but the eternal sort of economic thing that bubbles up is, well, okay, if we actually taxed the externalities of fossil fuel production, for example, we might get there sooner, better, faster. I'm not an economist, mind you, but that keeps coming around, and yet, of course, you say taxes, and immediately things go ballistic. So I don't know. I'd just be curious in your reaction on actually costing out the externalities of, in this instance, fossil fuel and carbon emissions.
Yeah, I mean, I would vote for that in a heartbeat. Of course, you know, carbon taxes, I think, and both carbon taxes and also just these more sort of command and control type limits on, you know, how much you can pollute and reducing every year, right? So that sort of thing. I mean, any kind of solution. I think that electoral politics so far has been extremely disappointing when it comes to the environment. You know, just as you say, people don't vote for Green New Deals. They don't vote for them everywhere. The left has lost, you know, it lost in the UK, it lost in Australia, it lost unlosable elections running on these kinds of platforms. And so that is another reason to work at the local level. I think green politics is more likely to be successful at the local level because it's about quality of life where people live. So it's more likely to be bipartisan. It's more likely to attract people kind of where they, you know, about things that matter to them, clean air, clean water, that sort of thing. So yeah, hey, I'm for any solution, you know, any solution. But so far, electoral politics has been extremely disappointing.
When Miami starts going underwater, then even the Republicans are in agreement. Next up is Jackie Hansen. Jackie, unmute yourself. Oh, she has her hand up. Jacqueline.
Jackie, you're muted. There, okay. Cathy, thank you for your presentation. My question is this: how did your work as a carpenter inform your work as a scholar?
What a beautiful question. Thank you. You know, I actually think there is a connection. So a couple of ways. One is that I think of writing as rather like joinery. You know, I learned a very traditional and old-fashioned kind of carpentry from a lovely old boy called Mr. O'Brien, who taught this this joinery class. And yeah, and I think, you know, that writing is a craft and that you should craft your prose in a way that really fits together in this extremely sturdy and clear kind of fashion. So just on the kind of craft level. But when it comes to this particular work, I do think that there's something about infrastructure that I find myself particularly drawn to. You know, we have three campaigns: pedagogy, finances, fossil-free finance, and energy systems. And I'm always drawn back to these energy systems, the energy systems aspect of the work. And I think it's because I used to work in construction, and so I really have a feel for the material world. Like, that is the aspect of it that I feel most drawn to. So yeah, there's all kinds of ways that I still feel like that construction worker is still in me somewhere. My laptop is resting on the desk I made, my special pandemic desk. So yeah, beautiful question, thank you.
Next up, Joel Dimsdale.
So I was very intrigued about this question about the tragedy of the commons in terms of our lives at the university and as laboratory managers. In a curious sort of way, we're like the Soviet Union. There are no power meters for us to be able to track energy use by laboratory. We don't get that feedback. And, you know, everyone is now aware of the ultra low freezers. What people may not be aware of is that they are beasts in terms of their power requirements and their unreliability, regrettably. They break down regularly. How to get the information to us about what we're doing, what pieces of equipment we choose to buy. This would be useful particularly for those of us who have labs. It may be less relevant on the standard 120 square foot faculty office, but still relevant there somewhat. Curious if your group's looking at that.
Another fantastic question. This is the best group. Yeah, so we do have a Green Labs. I mean, you may be aware of the Green Labs program, which is a certification program. And I think that it looks at a bunch of different aspects of laboratory energy use and so on. But yeah, you're absolutely, I mean, that's so interesting. And one of the things that I've learned from actually talking to the people at UCSD in charge of infrastructure, and the wonderful engineer, John Dilliot, who is in charge of the cogeneration plant, and you know, other people who work on the infrastructure, is what an incredibly energy intensive activity scientific research is. Autoclaves, freezers, servers, all of these things are fantastically energy intensive. And this is one of the reasons why generating our own electricity, hospitals, of course, this is one of the reasons why generating our own electricity by burning gas in the cogeneration plant is such a handy strategy, because it gives us all this resilience, and it's extremely energy efficient, actually. The problem is that we got to get off the gas, that everyone's got to get off the gas. This is the great kind of frontier of addressing emissions. And so, yeah, so this idea of kind of individual metering, that's so interesting to get a kind of feedback. I mean, one of the issues is that it's extremely centralized, the energy production and consumption at UCSD. I don't even know, so I don't even know if it was, if individual labs could be individually metered with the current structure, but it's a superb idea. The place that actually has electrified their campus is Stanford University. And they have this incredible system. And we've talked to the people who were in charge of making that happen, one of the people who was in charge of making that happen. And they do this continual monitoring of the energy use across the campus. And it's partly a resiliency question. So they're always looking for how to kind of move around the energy use to times and places of high demand. So they may have something in that system that would be applicable to your question. But it's a super question. And I think there is a way that the centralization of the energy system at UCSD leads exactly to what you're saying, which is a certain kind of sort of unknowing kind of extravagance in the energy use. Yeah.
Mhm. Our next question is from John Semiro.
Hi, I just wanted to address, I'm the safety officer for SIO, and a couple of things. We're having we're going to do a virtual sustainability conference in April. And one of the issues that we're going to address in that conference is exactly the question that Joel asked. And we are getting the fume hood and freezer counts from each lab at SIO, and then we're correlating that to building electrical usage, because we can do that. We can get we know fairly well within certain margins from John Dilliot, the energy footprint, the electrical energy footprint of each building. So then we're going to try to correlate that to hoods and freezers. So there is some work in that area, and anybody who's willing to help or knows information, please email me. It's jsemerau@ucsd.edu. I don't want to step on Cathy's toes too much, but I just wanted to throw that out there that we're working on that. And Joel, that might, answer a couple questions, hopefully, because I do know that freezers are a huge amount of energy. So just wanted to throw that in the mix.
That's fantastic, John. Thank you so much. That's really, really interesting. Is this with a view, SIO, how does SIO even get its energy?
So SIO, generally speaking, from what I know, SIO has a trunk cable from the power plant down to the campus, and that is monitored quite well. And there are dashboards for each individual building electrical usage. It doesn't necessarily capture everything, but it's pretty darn close. The other area that we're looking at, that I'm looking at specifically, is just developing a little spreadsheet of a worst case emissions from ship emissions, because they burn so much diesel fuel, and it's a huge issue that's never really been quite granularly looked at. The combustion of carbon, the combustion of gasoline and diesel in the marine environment. So we're looking at that as well, and that'll be an interesting metric. It's also very interesting, and hopefully we'll have a presentation by Bruce Applegate on converting or purchasing fleets that are hydrogen powered. Just to throw out a real wild card, I thought that was interesting that hydrogen power could be used for fleets. So
Fantastic. This is music. Sorry, go on.
And also I would say, Cathy, that it's what you were saying was, I immediately thought of SIO's maritime fleet as kind of, it is sort of a common property. It really is. It's sort of, everybody loves it, and everybody, thinks of it as a common ownership. Like a lot of people toured the Sally Ride, they can get real into it. it's a very interesting concept. So I really like what you were saying about that. It resonated with me.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating what you say. I just wanted to say about one of my conversations with John Dilliard. He talked about some of the energy savings and efficiency gains that you would get from maybe centralizing, you know, the servers and the freezers and the autoclaves and things like that. But this is, you know, of course, the labs, it's inconvenient. So there's kind of trade-offs there. But anyway,
Yeah.
I'm well into the weeds of some of this stuff, and it's just so wonderful to hear about SIO. God, fascinating. Okay, good.
We want to squeeze in 2 more questions for you before we let you go. Bob Knox again, and then Harry Poole.
Yeah, just quickly for me, I was Bruce Applegate's predecessor in his job. And yeah, it's a tough nut to crack. I mean, obviously the old ships were built long before anybody started thinking about carbon-free ships. There is serious thinking going on now about a hydrogen-powered ship. Be careful what you ask for, because hydrogen comes from natural gas, unless you make it by electrolysis, which is more expensive. So, you know, the devil is in the details to some extent, but I think there's a possible avenue of success there in terms of future ships, which will either be much less fossil fuel intense, or maybe even examples of ones that that don't need fossil fuels at all. Again, it probably comes back at some level, in part, to the question of, oh, okay, if there's real serious taxes on carbon, that's going to affect what the shipping industry, generally speaking, not just SIO, does about future ships. I mean, I think it's interesting to note that Scripps has for a long time at least powered its ships off the shore electricity when they're in port in San Diego and wherever else they can get the right shore power to do that. Once they're out at sea, then obviously they've got to burn diesel. But they've done a much better job than the average marine industry in terms of not running their diesel generators while they're sitting alongside in port.
All right.
Fascinating.
We'll have time for just one more question from Harry Poole. Go ahead, Professor Poole. Is he no longer with us? We may have lost him. He had his hand up. Stephen,
Yes.
Move the screen if you're going to turn.
you want to go ahead and close up then?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Again, thank you, Professor Gere. First of all, it's great to see your face, which I haven't had the chance to see live in quite some time. So it's wonderful to see you. And thanks again, Cathy, for doing this great presentation. And I know it stimulated a lot of conversation that will continue beyond the clock striking 5 in a minute. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance. We are grateful to be able to present to our colleagues in the Emeriti and Retirement Associations. Professor Trey Eidecker from the School of Medicine and Bioengineering will be joining us in February for our next talk on February 10th. And again, please join me in thanking Professor Gere for her presentation today. And everybody be well and take care. Suzanne, thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.